The 9,731st meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation who asked for the floor.
Mr. President, before we begin this meeting, I wish to draw attention to a number of issues which are of fundamental importance for the understanding of procedural issues. As is well known from the beginning of in the program of work of the Slovenian presidency for the month of September, there were no high-level briefings on Ukraine. There was no high-level briefing on Ukraine enshrined here. This there was only one meeting during the high-level week proposed by the presidency on a unifying issue, namely leadership for peace. This could have resulted in an interesting discussion building upon the question of enhancing the effectiveness of multilateral cooperation, which we raised during our presidency of the Security Council in July. This could have been the case. However, clearly that will not be the case. And this is because Western countries could not refrain from poisoning the atmosphere, once again trying to fill airtime with a hackneyed Ukrainian issue, which the entire world, the rest of the world, sees as such. The only reason behind their convening this meeting is to provide Vladimir Zelenskyy with yet another concert stage at the United Nations, and this time in the chamber of the Security Council. And for his course, a whole group of members of the EU and NATO have gathered together, and they are marching in lockstep each time they are called upon to travel to the Security Council to malign the Russian Federation. This could have even been an interesting illustration of how these countries are dependent in their foreign policy agendas, dependent on Big Brother. In NATO, were it not at the same time yet another grim example of how the collective West, for the advancement of their geopolitical agendas, continues to deal blow after blow to the authority of the United Nations Security Council. And today, the Slovenian presidency intends to allow an entire 11 delegations to participate in this meeting under Rules 37 and 39 of the provisional rules of the Security Council, even though this format is not an open debate, but this is a briefing which, in accordance with existing practice, does not provide for such a number of participants from among non-council members. What criteria was the presidency guided by when they convened this group? We understand Ukraine and the European Union are countries are bordering, but what about Lithuania, Germany, Denmark, Italy, Germany? What direct relationship do they have with what is happening? For them, this is just an opportunity to be seen on television screens and to engage in anti-Russia rhetoric. The Slovenian presidency is perfectly aware of this. They, from the very beginning of their shift at the Security Council, declared a commitment to enhancing the effectiveness of its work and promised to strictly adhere to the practice of this body. However, all of these promises were empty promises, and Slovenia simply bent and yielded to the pressure of the senior comrades from Brussels and other European capitals. We regret that this took place. Ultimately, the Security Council will have to listen to the cookie-cutter, cut and pasted statements drafted by Brussels for members of the EU and NATO, which provide no added value whatsoever to the discussion. I wish to state that when it comes to listening to these hackneyed statements and these cookie-cutter statements, we have no intention of wasting time on that. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I take note of the issue he has raised. I agree that as a general principle, proportionality in numbers should be observed when the Security Council invites non-Council member states to participate in Council meetings. And as Council President for this month, we have been moderate as to the number of non-Council members invited to participate, including for today's meeting. Nonetheless, I wish to underline that the criterion set out in Rule 37 of the Provisional Rules of Procedure for participation is based not on numbers, but rather that the interests of a state should be specially affected. Each of the non-members to be invited to today's meeting has been invited to participate in various Security Council meetings on Ukraine prior to this one, and has thus already been considered by the Council to meet the criterion of being specially affected. It is our view, therefore, that it is correct procedure for an invitation to participate be extended to each of them again today. And as for the open debate, Leadership for Peace, it remains on the agenda for tomorrow, and all members of the United Nations are invited to participate. I would like to warmly welcome the Secretary General, distinguished presidents, ministers, and other high-level representatives present in the Security Council chamber. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with the Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Denmark, Germany, Hungary, Italy, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, Turkey, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I know. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite His Excellency Mr. Joseph Borrell Fontelles, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided.
The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item number 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to the Secretary General, His Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres.
Mr. President, Excellencies, 2 days ago, in the newly agreed Pact for the Future, world leaders reaffirmed their commitment to international law and to the Charter of the United Nations. Our organization is based on the principle of sovereignty of all member states within their internationally recognized borders. The Charter unequivocally stipulates that all states must refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any other state, and that international disputes must be settled by peaceful means. Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, following the illegal annexation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol a decade ago, is a clear violation of these principles. And civilian populations continue to pay the price. The death toll keeps rising, nearly 10 million people have fled their homes. Systematic attacks against hospitals, schools, supermarkets are only adding pain and misery. Power cuts and infrastructure damage have left millions in the dark. I strongly condemn all attacks on civilians and civilian facilities wherever they occur and whoever is responsible. They all must stop immediately. And I remain deeply concerned about the safety, humanitarian needs and basic human rights of people residing in occupied areas. Mr. President, despite immense challenges, the United Nations remains fully engaged as the largest international presence in Ukraine. This year alone, and together with our partners, we have provided life-saving aid to more than 6.2 million people. but we need the support of the international community. 15 million people in Ukraine require humanitarian assistance, more than half of them women and girls. But as winter is approaching, less than half of our 2024 humanitarian response plan is funded. I urge donors to help us pursue our vital work on the ground. We are also assisting the government of Ukraine in its recovery and reconstruction efforts. This includes access to basic services and the restoration of Ukraine's energy production capacities. In recent weeks, we have seen a resurgence of inflammatory rhetoric and incidents around nuclear sites, particularly at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and, alarmingly, at the Kursk nuclear power plant in the Russian Federation. I commend the International Atomic Energy Agency, including its critical presence in Ukraine's nuclear sites, to help ensure nuclear safety and security. And I urge all parties to act responsibly and avoid any declaration or action that could further destabilize an already incendiary situation. Monsieur le Président.
President, 2.5 years since the full-blown invasion of Ukraine, more than 11,000 civilians have been killed. The longer this tragic war continues, the greater the risk of escalation and spillover. This would not only impact the region, but further deepen global tensions and divisions at a time when our world desperately needs more cooperation and collective action. We must stop the suffering and break the cycle of violence for the sake of the people of Ukraine, the people of Russia, and the world. The Black Sea Initiative and the continued exchanges of prisoners of war serve as reminders that when there is political will, diplomacy can succeed, even in the darkest hour. Today, though the prospects for peace may seem distant, I am inspired by the growing calls for dialogue. So let us intensify our efforts to seek peace in Ukraine. A just, comprehensive, and sustainable peace, in line with the United Nations Charter, international law, and the resolutions of the General Assembly. The United Nations stands ready to support all efforts towards achieving that goal. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President of Ukraine.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much, Your Excellencies. One day in this hall, it will surely be said that Russia's war against Ukraine has ended, not frozen, not paused, not forgotten, truly ended. And this will happen not because someone got tired of the war, not because someone traded something with Putin. Russia's war against Ukraine will end because the UN Charter will work. It must work. Our Ukrainian right to self-defense must prevail. Our cooperation with nations of the world who value life as we do, our territorial integrity, our sovereignty, the independence of our country. And we are defending what every nation would surely want to protect for itself and what the UN Charter grants to all. And it is Russia that always has to lie to justify its war, not us. Russia cannot refer to the UN Charter to explain what it is doing against us, against Ukraine, Ukrainian people. In fact, in Russia's perverted way, in its crooked world, it does refer to the Charter, but that's simply insane. Russia stayed silent because it couldn't explain why a Russian missile recently struck a grain ship bound for an Egyptian port through the Black Sea. Russia either stays silent or lies about why its drones and missiles are found in the airspace of Poland, Moldova, Romania. Every day, Ukrainians are wounded and killed. Every day. Today, once again, Russian bombs hit residential buildings. Even an ordinary bread factory became a target. What's so threatening to Russia about making bread? Putin has no answer, and Russia never has an honest answer when asked why its army kills children in Ukraine, defeats schools and hospitals, and fights not for justice but for a blackout for a neighboring nation. Putin has nothing to say if you ask him why he tries to drag Belarus into the war, why his propagandists threaten nations in the Caucasus or Central Asia, or why Russia invests the most not in human development, but in hatred. Russia has no legitimate reason, none at all, for making Iran and North Korea de facto accomplices in its criminal war in Europe, with their weapons, killing us, killing Ukrainians, and helping Putin steal our land from our people. We know some in the world want to talk to Putin. We know it, to meet, to talk, to speak, but what could they possibly hear from him? That he's upset because we are exercising our right to defend our people, or that he wants to keep the war and terror going just so no one thinks he was wrong. It's insane too. From the very first second of this war, Russia has been doing things that cannot possibly be justified under the UN Charter. Every destroyed Ukrainian city, every burned village, and there are already hundreds and hundreds serves as proof that Russia is committing an international crime. And that's why this war can't simply fade away. That's why this war can't be calmed by talks. Action is needed. And I'm grateful to all the nations that are truly helping in ways that save the lives of our people. Putin has broken so many international norms and rules that he won't stop on his own. Russia can only be forced into peace. And that is exactly what's needed, forcing Russia into peace as the sole aggressor in this war, the sole violator of the UN Charter. Now, as we near the third winter of this war, Russia is once again trying to destroy our energy system, and this fall they are being even more cynical. They are preparing to target our nuclear power plants, 3 of them. We have this information, and we have proof of this. If Russia is ready to go that far, it means nothing you value matters to Moscow. This kind of Russian cynicism will keep striking if it's given any room in the world. The UN Charter leaves no room for that, and that's why the peace formula leaves no room either. In 2022, in the midst of the war, when I proposed the peace formula, I was proposing to uphold the UN Charter, to make effective everything that this institution was created for. Every point of the peace formula is rooted in the principles and purposes and norms of the UN Charter, in the rights it grants nations, and in the resolutions of the General Assembly that have already been supported by the majority of the nations. And we do not have different versions of the UN Charter for different parts of the world. We do not have regional quasi-charters. There is no separate UN Charter for BRICS or for the G7. There is no separate Russian-Iranian UN Charter or no separate Chinese-Brazilian UN Charter. There is one UN Charter which unites everyone, must unite everyone. The path to a just peace is the same. Clear steps that everyone understands equally, and this is reflected in the peace formula. It is the fulfillment of the UN Charter. And we all know what needs to be done if we honestly look at the situation and truly want to stop Russia's war, and most importantly, act together, of course in unity. without creating new and unnecessary divisions of the world into blocs or regional groups. Unity always works for peace. And we have to prepare the second peace summit to end the war altogether. And I invite all of you, all principled nations, to join us in this process, all who truly respect the UN Charter. We invite China, we invite Brazil, I have already invited India, we are working with African nations, with all of Latin America, Middle East, Central Asia, Europe, the Pacific region, North America, all. All are equally important for peace, all, without exceptions, just as the UN Charter must work without exceptions. This is the process that will lead us to peace, to a just peace, a real peace, a peace that will last. All of us already know how to achieve it. We have the peace formula, we have the UN Charter, and we have all the strengths needed to make it happen. What's needed is determination. Thank you so much. Slava Ukraini.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Zelenskyy, for his statement, and I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Prime Minister of Slovenia. I wish to thank the Secretary General for his insightful thoughts. I welcome the participation of President Zelenskyy at this meeting, and I also appreciate the participation of other countries at this discussion. Excellencies, the European countries are united in condemnation of this aggression, which violates every possible principle and law, including UN Charter. My colleagues will elaborate more on this. I'm genuinely frustrated that I sit here in front of you at this Council, together with the most powerful countries of the world, with the sole responsibility to ensure peace and security across the globe, and yet we are unable to do anything about the most extensive conventional war the world has seen in decades, that we are powerless in bringing peace to the citizens in Ukraine. It is a good opportunity to accept some sobering truths and acknowledge that this Council has failed the people of Ukraine. But please, allow me to shed a slightly different light on the Ukrainian case. Even in this dire situation, while Ukrainian civilian casualties are on the rise, while critical civilian infrastructure is collapsing, and while battlefields keep expanding, Ukraine has not failed the international community. Far from it. Even in the darkest moments of this ongoing aggression, Ukraine remained an active member of the United Nations who stood in solidarity with other countries. I can personally attest to this. 1 year ago, Slovenia experienced unprecedented floods of catastrophic dimensions. Rivers were overflowing, family houses were buried underneath heaps of earth, and people were drowning. It was a catastrophe of proportions never seen before in my country. And during all of this, Ukraine displayed a gesture Slovenians will never forget. During the war, while missiles and drones were hitting Kiev and other Ukrainian cities, Ukraine sent a whole convoy of aid and over 50 members of its national emergency team to help deal with the aftermath of the floods in our country. Usually we would all say that we stand with Ukraine, but when it really mattered to us Slovenians, it was Ukraine who stood with Slovenia. While Ukrainian ports and ships are under constant barrage, and while the Ukrainian civilian population is suffering, Ukraine has done its utmost to practice solidarity with the rest of the world. With its Grain from Ukraine initiative, it has ensured the flow of tens of thousands of tons of grain to those who need it most. Even in the midst of existential war, Ukraine stands with the international community and member states when they need it. For Slovenia, the case is clear. With this war, a lot is at stake. If Russia wins this war, then trampling of international humanitarian law and gross violations of the Charter will win as well. If Putin prevails, not only Europe, but the whole of the world will become less safe and less stable. The United Nations were created to prevent bigger countries from imposing their will on their neighbors. We should not allow its members to violate rules and the UN Charter with impunity just because they believe they can. If unchallenged, each of us will pay the price. This is not a world Slovenia wants to be part of. We will do everything in our power to prevent this from becoming a new normal and preserve the integrity of the Charter and international law, not just in Ukraine, but also in Palestine and the rest of the Middle East. Dear colleagues, the process of restoring European security and healing the rifts in the international relationship can begin only when peace in Ukraine is achieved. Until then, we will keep pressing for peace. Only a just peace will give generations of Ukrainians a brighter future, and only a lasting peace will allow them to grow and flourish. Such peace cannot come at the expense of fundamental principles enshrined in the UN Charter, including the respect for territorial integrity. This vision is worth believing in and acting towards it. Slovenia will continue to stand by Ukraine until they achieve this vision of just peace. And I know Ukraine will stand with us if and when we need it. I shall now I resume my function as the President of the Council, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ian Borg, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign and European Affairs and Trade of the Republic of Malta.
Mr. President, I begin by thanking the Slovenian Presidency for convening today's meeting and the Secretary General for his important briefing and sobering remarks. I also welcome the participation of President Zelenskyy. Malta remains gravely concerned about the security and humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We are also deeply worried about the negative repercussions that this war is having and will continue to have on the multilateral system. By invading its sovereign neighbor in violation of international law, Russia also launched a direct affront to the UN Charter. The international community cannot and must not look the other way. This war, which has now been going on for 2.5 years, is having devastating consequences on the region and beyond. Ukraine, just like every other country, has the right to live in peace and security within its internationally recognized borders. It has been denied this right for far too long. This is why we have joined others in calling for this meeting. Mr. President, over the past 2 months, we have witnessed an intensification of attacks in Ukraine. Missiles and drones have impacted civilians and continue to increase the death toll. They have also targeted critical infrastructure in Ukraine, in particular energy infrastructure. Coordinated attacks on Ukraine's electric power system have damaged or destroyed numerous power generation and distribution facilities. The effects on the civilian population will last for years and will require significant resources. The impact that explosive remnants of war will have on future generations also merit our full attention. In the shorter term, the people of Ukraine will have to contend with an electricity deficit and limited heating during the harsh winter months. Such attacks unnecessarily endanger lives in the upcoming cold winter months. The Security Council cannot let violations of international humanitarian law go unchecked. Critical infrastructure must never be a target. Hospitals must never be a target. Schools must never be a target. And most of all, civilians and children must never be a target. We must continue our efforts to make sure that all perpetrators of such crimes are held accountable. Mr. President, it's imperative that we ensure the nuclear safety of Ukraine's nuclear power plants and to uphold IAEA's 7 pillars for nuclear safety. On numerous occasions, Malta has called on all parties to respect international humanitarian law and uphold the fundamental principles of distinction and proportionality. These are non-negotiable. This war is also having a disproportionate impact on women and children. It has created the largest displacement crisis in decades, with more than 4 million people internally displaced and 6 million living as refugees abroad. Malta strongly reiterates the need to provide humanitarian access to all aid workers operating in Ukraine, and to allow the UN and the related agencies to carry out their duties unhindered. According to OCHA, 14.6 million Ukrainians are in need of humanitarian aid. We must make sure that their needs are met. Malta is also deeply concerned with the possible escalation of this conflict due to the transfer of weapons and related materials to the Russian Federation from DPRK and Iran. This Council needs to ensure that all weapon transfers are done in accordance with international law and in line with the Security Council resolutions. Furthermore, there are also disarmament treaties which ban whole categories of weapons that should not be used in the battlefield. Mr. President, at the end of October last year, in Malta, we hosted talks on Ukraine's 10-point plan for peace, with the participation of more than 65 countries and international organizations. Malta remains committed to assisting Ukraine so as to achieve a comprehensive framework that will lead to a just as well as lasting peace for the people in Ukraine. On this occasion, we again call on the Russian Federation to cease all hostilities and withdraw its forces from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The international community requires a lasting solution to this conflict, a peace which respects borders, human rights, and the UN Charter. Until that day comes, Ukraine has the right to defend itself from this aggression in line with Article 51 of the Charter. I thank you.
Thank His Excellency Mr. Borg for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Wang Yi, member of the Political Bureau of the CPC Central Committee and Minister for Foreign Affairs of the People's Republic of China.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, colleagues, I thank Prime Minister Golub for chairing today's meeting. I thank Secretary General Guterres for his briefing, and I have noted the position that President Zelenskyy has stated. The Ukraine crisis is now in its third year. Conflict and fighting continue to spread, civilian casualties continue to rise, spillovers continue to intensify, but the prospects of peace are still far away. Every day that the crisis drags on brings more suffering to the people, more destruction to the region, and more volatility to the world. The situation is not sustainable and must be turned around. All parties should take peace as the priority and the people as the priority, and be genuinely committed to promoting peace talks. To that end, China has the following propositions. First, we should have a greater sense of crisis and cool down the situation. The pressing priority is to observe the three principles of no expansion of the battlefield, no escalation of fighting, and no provocation by any party. In particular, weapons of mass destruction must not be used. Nuclear power plants and other peaceful nuclear facilities must not be attacked. Civilians and civilian facilities must not be attacked. The more that weapons are sent to the battlefield, the more difficult it is to achieve the goal of ceasefire. This is the reality that we must face up to. All parties must abandon the Cold War confrontation mentality and play a constructive role for cooling down the situation and create the necessary conditions for achieving a ceasefire at an early date. Second, we should have a greater sense of responsibility to promote peace talks. Dialogue and negotiation are the only viable way to settle the Ukraine crisis. If day after day peace talks cannot be launched, then misjudgment and miscalculation would build, which leads to even greater crisis. Recently, there have been more calls for peace on the international stage. More and more countries in the global south have come together to support peace and create the atmosphere and conditions for peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. The international community should seize the opportunities before us and build synergy for promoting peace talks. Third, we should have a greater sense of urgency to manage spillovers. The spillover of the Ukraine crisis has further weighed down the global economy. The many countries in the global south have been severely impacted. This adds difficulty to achieving the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. No party should make the crisis an excuse to abuse unlawful unilateral sanctions and suppress normal business activities, still less divide the world by creating various exclusive groups. China calls on the international community to strengthen cooperation on energy, finance, trade, and food security, as well as the protection of oil and gas pipelines and other critical infrastructure. Jointly keep global industrial and supply chains stable and smooth, and protect the legitimate rights and interests and development space of developing countries. The Security Council has primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. On the Ukraine issue, the Security Council should bridge differences, advocate commonality and shelving of differences, uphold common security, and build lasting peace. We hope that members of the Security Council will keep in mind the big picture and the long term, do more things conducive to reconciliation and peace, and not the opposite. Mr. President, China's position on the Ukraine issue is consistent and clear. Chinese President Xi Jinping has solemnly pointed out that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries should be respected. The purposes and principles of the UN Charter should be observed. The legitimate security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, and all efforts conducive to a peaceful settlement of the crisis should be supported. This is the authoritative and fundamental position of China on the Ukraine issue. China is not a creator of the Ukraine crisis, nor are we a party to it. China has all along stood on the side of peace. We continue engagement with all relevant parties, including Russia and Ukraine, relentlessly pursue peace talks, actively carry out shuttle diplomacy, and our efforts have received wide recognition and support from the international community. China has released the document China's Position on the Political Settlement of the Ukraine Crisis, and together with Brazil, released the 6-point consensus. We have played our due role for building consensus and promoting the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis. I also wish to make it clear that on the Ukraine issue, any move to shift responsibility onto China or attack and smear China is irresponsible and will lead nowhere. Mr. President, the world we are in is full of changes and transformation, and humanity faces challenges and risks like never before. To work for the political settlement of the Ukraine crisis and build a safer world is the common aspiration of the international community and a common responsibility of countries around the world. China calls on the international community to join hands in practicing a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable vision of security and build more consensus for a ceasefire at an early date, to send out more rational voices for political settlement, and to make more common efforts for lasting peace and security of the region. Thank you.
Thank His Excellency Mr. Yi for his statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antony Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. President, and welcome, President Zelenskyy. We meet more than 2.5 years since Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, shredding the core principles of the United Nations Charter: sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Every day since, Russia has waged a war of aggression, the textbook example of a threat to international peace and security that this Council was created to prevent and address. The question before us today is not what will Russia do? We already know that. Putin will continue to wage his unjust war. The question before us is how we, members of this Council, can end Putin's war and reinforce the international rules and rights that make all of our nations safer and more secure. There are two immediate and interrelated steps that we must take. First, we must address Russia's growing cooperation with North Korea and Iran. Iran has been providing armed drones to the Kremlin since 2022. It built a drone factory in Russia. Just a few weeks ago, it transferred hundreds of short-range ballistic missiles to Russia. And Tehran has trained Russian military personnel in Iran how to operate these weapons. Meanwhile, the DPRK has delivered trainloads of weapons and ammunition to Russia, including ballistic missiles, launchers, and millions of artillery rounds. Support from Tehran and Pyongyang is helping Putin inflict carnage, suffering, and ruin on innocent Ukrainian men, women, and children, demolish Ukrainian apartment buildings, grain silos, and ports, ravage Ukrainian power plants, heating, and natural gas facilities, just as freezing temperatures are setting in. These actions by Iran, North Korea, and Russia have violated multiple Security Council resolutions, resolutions that Russia voted for and, as a permanent member, has a special responsibility to enforce. This is also not a one-way street. The more Russia relies on their support, the more Iran and North Korea extract in return. And the more Putin gives to Pyongyang and Tehran, the more he exacerbates threats to peace and security, not just in Europe, but in the Indo-Pacific, in the Middle East, all around the globe. As North Korea ramps up its military support for Russia, Putin has reciprocated with military commitments and with money. The two countries recently revived a treaty pledging to provide military assistance if either is invaded. In March, Russia used its veto to end the work of the UN panel of experts on the DPRK, which for 14 years had monitored the regime's nuclear and ballistic missile programs. Russia's banks are helping North Korea evade sanctions, freeing up more funds for its unlawful weapons programs. All this for a regime that has carried out more than 150 ballistic missile tests since 2022, and whose leader routinely threatens to obliterate South Korea and Japan and other countries. Meanwhile, as Tehran provides Putin with drones, ballistic missiles, and training, Russia is sharing technology with Iran on nuclear issues, as well as space information. The two countries have accelerated negotiations on a comprehensive strategic partnership. Last year, Russia announced plans to send Iran advanced fighter aircraft and attack helicopters. This, as Iran continues to arm, to train, and to fund proxies in the Middle East to carry out terrorist attacks across the region and beyond, including Hamas, whose appalling October 7th attacks killed civilians from over a dozen UN member states, and including the Houthis, whose attacks on international shipping have driven up the cost of food, of medicine, other supplies for people around the world, and have added to the suffering of the Yemeni people. North Korea and Iran are not the only ones aiding and abetting Russia. China, another permanent member of this Council, is the top provider of machine tools, microelectronics, and other items that Russia is using to rebuild, to restock, to ramp up its war machine and sustain its brutal aggression. Now, some may ask how the United States or any other country helping Ukraine defend itself can criticize countries for providing military support to Russia. There is a profound difference. Russia is the aggressor, Ukraine the victim. Russia fights for conquest, Ukraine fights for survival. If countries stop supporting Russia, Putin's invasion would soon come to an end. If countries stop supporting Ukraine, Ukraine could soon come to an end. This brings me to the second step that members of this Council can take. One of the Council's primary responsibilities is seeking to peacefully resolve conflicts. As President Zelenskyy has said, no one wants peace more than Ukraine. The United States also wants to end this conflict. And before Putin launched his full invasion, we used every tool we could to try to prevent it, including right here at the Security Council. But the way the Council seeks to end this conflict matters. The UN Charter is crystal clear on this point. When fulfilling its responsibilities, the Security Council, and I quote, shall act in accordance with the purpose and principles of the United Nations, end quote. In other words, we must seek a peace that upholds rather than undermines the UN's core tenets. That's why all of us here have a responsibility to support Ukraine's call for a just and lasting peace to end Russia's war of aggression. A just and lasting peace must affirm the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. A just and lasting peace must preserve Ukraine's right to choose its own path, its own allies, its own future. A just and lasting peace requires Ukraine's full participation and assent. A just and lasting peace must support Ukraine's reconstruction and recovery, with Russia paying to fix the damage it's caused. A just and lasting peace must address both accountability and reconciliation. The United States is ready and willing to work with any party dedicated to supporting peace based on these principles. Ukraine has said multiple times that diplomacy is the only way to end this war, and that it's prepared to engage in negotiations. Putin, on the other hand, has no interest in such a peace, recently declaring that Russia would return to the negotiating table only when Ukraine withdraws its troops from Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, Zaporizhia. In other words, when Ukraine withdraws from its own territory. Putin continues to claim falsely that Ukraine is not a real state. He continues to deny that the Ukrainian people have their own identity. In Putin's eyes, the Ukrainian people, like Ukraine itself, do not exist. Other countries have put forward their own proposals, some of which make no mention of the UN Charter or its principles, fail to distinguish between the aggressor and the aggressed, and call on all sides to de-escalate. A proposal along these lines would reward Putin's aggression, allow him to rest, rearm, re-invade Ukraine, as he has done time and again. It would also embolden would-be aggressors everywhere around the world. As history teaches us, peace without principle is prologue to more conflict, to more suffering, to more instability. So, to all nations who want this conflict to end, and do it in a way that will endure, the quickest way forward is simple. Stop those who are enabling and fueling Putin's aggression, and demand a just peace that upholds the principles of the United Nations Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Blinken for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jean-Noël Barrot, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, for 2.5 years now, Ukraine, with admirable courage, has been exercising its right to legitimate self-defense, a right that is unambiguously recognized in the Charter of the United Nations, that of defending its freedom, its territory, its independence, its existence. I welcome the presence of President Zelenskyy among us here. He embodies the struggle being waged by the Ukrainian people. This is a struggle that is ours as well. How can we not be outraged in light of the brutal, illegal, unjustifiable war of aggression being waged by Russia against Ukraine? In light of the massive ongoing violations of the most basic principles of the UN Charter, in light of this intractability and deafness of Russia when more than 140 states condemned it in unequivocal votes at the General Assembly of the United Nations, how can we not be outraged in light of the systematic and deliberate bombardment of civilian objects, in light of the ruthless, methodical destruction of energy infrastructure, which is plunging the Ukrainian people into darkness, and cold? How can we not be outraged before the atrocities and the repeated violations of human rights and IHL? How can we not condemn rape being used as a weapon of war? The Ukrainian people are enduring unspeakable atrocities. This must be put to an end. The suffering must be put to an end. How can we not be outraged in the light of the plight of the Ukrainian children, the young cancer patients near the rubble of the Children's Hospital in Kyiv, the young Ukrainian people whose mental health is deteriorating, the orphaned boys and girls, the children, the infants dead as a result of Russian strikes, the children who have been torn away from their families and subjected to so-called re-education by Russia or in Belarus, treatment of unspeakable cruelty. What has become of them? What will become of them? France will continue to stand by those who are fighting for the return of the Ukrainian children and to support initiatives underway. There can be no impunity for the crimes that have been committed. The International Criminal Court has already issued 6 arrest warrants against Russian officials, and Russia must be held accountability. There must be no complicity in these crimes which are shocking to humanity. There is no equivalence between support for Ukraine and Russia. Russia is flouting all rules and attacking its democratic and peaceful neighbor. Ukraine is exercising its right to self-defense pursuant to its moral duty. Nobody can support Russia. France urges all states to refrain from delivering weapons to Russia, dual-use goods to Russia, and components which fuel the war of aggression. First and foremost, this is addressed to North Korea and Iran. We condemn in the strongest terms the transfer by Iran of ballistic missiles to Russia, which has recently been confirmed. This is a significant escalation and a direct threat to European security. Our concern is all the greater in light of the fact that Russia continues its aggressive and dangerous maneuvers on the Ukrainian continent, increasingly brazenly. The territorial integrity of a number of European countries has been violated repeatedly this year. Russia is continuing to destabilize such democracies as Moldova and Armenia, 2 democratic states whose sole wrong, in the view of Moscow, was having chosen freedom. The Russian war of aggression affects all of us beyond the European continent where this is taking place. This is of concern for the entire world. This is a war against food security, energy security. Many states and populations are being afflicted by the consequences thereof. And today, not Russia, but France and its partners who are facilitating the delivery of Ukrainian grain to the civilian population of Gaza. The Russian war of aggression is also a war being waged against the international order. To accept the Russian fait accompli would be to accept the embodiment of might makes right. This would leave the door open to other modifications of borders with force. This would be tantamount to a renunciation of the basic principles of the Charter of the UN, including sovereignty and territorial integrity. This would be a renunciation of the very possibility of envisaging collective security. This is our reason for being here at the United Nations, which is under attack. For these reasons, this is our very reason for being at the United Nations, which is under attack. For these reasons, the formula based on our fatigue and our demobilization is and will remain a misguided calculation. France will continue to support Ukraine at all levels and over the long term. We will leverage all European instruments and including guaranteeing Ukraine a path towards the European Union and NATO. A path other than that of aggression and devastation is possible. That is that of a just peace, which needs to be rooted firmly in international law and respect for territorial integrity. This cannot take the shape of capitulation by the victim, for there is a victim and an aggressor. France will continue to deliver its support to that end, to the Zelenskyy peace plan. Ukraine needs to be free to choose its alliances and its path. Mr. President, if Russia if Russia decides no longer to be a source of insecurity and instability, another future can take shape. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Barrot for his statement, and now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Cho Tu-yul, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Republic of Korea.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you, Dr. Robert Golob, Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia, for convening this meeting. I also extend my appreciation to Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his insightful briefing, and I also welcome President Zelenskyy to this important meeting. 2.5 years have passed since the Russian Federation launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a conflict that continues to this day to challenge the values and norms that underpin our collective global security. The Republic of Korea remains steadfast in supporting the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Despite repeated calls from the Security Council members for an immediate end to the war, Russia continues its brutal attacks, claiming tens of thousands of civilian lives and destroying the livelihood of millions of innocent citizens. Even more worrying is the recent escalation along the battlefronts, which has led to a significant increase in civilian casualties and the destruction of critical infrastructure. Our hearts are heavy as we witnessed the humanitarian tragedy unfolding in Ukraine. As a nation all too familiar with the anguish of conflict, the Republic of Korea profoundly emphasizes with the struggles endured by the Ukrainian people. This shared understanding strengthens our resolve to end this war and restore peace in Ukraine. The Ukraine Peace and Solidarity Initiative, launched by President Yoon Suk-yeol on the occasion of his visit to Kiev in July 2023, is a powerful testament to our solidarity with Ukraine. Under this initiative, the Republic of Korea committed $200 million in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine this year. Starting from next year, we will provide $2 billion to be spread out for 5 years to support Ukrainians' reconstruction. We are also collaborating with international partners through the Ukraine Donor Platform in support of reconstruction efforts in Ukraine. Mr. President, we express grave concern over the military cooperation between the Russian Federation and North Korea. The number and targeted areas of Russia's attacks using North Korean ballistic missiles are increasing in both frequency and intensity, which results in endangering civilians and promoting this brutal war. This constitutes an unequivocal violation of multiple UN Security Council resolutions. The deepening military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, which was highlighted by the signing of the so-called Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, not only threatens the peace and security on the Korean Peninsula, but also of Europe. It is deplorable that Russia, a permanent Security Council member and one of the founding states for the non-proliferation regime, violates Security Council resolutions and engage in illegal arms trade with North Korea. Any cooperation that directly or indirectly aids North Korea's military capability is a blatant violation of the relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions and undermines non-proliferation regime. We strongly urge North Korea to comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions and to respond to our proposals to engage in dialogue. Mr. President, the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has aggravated geopolitical tensions worldwide, presenting us with challenges of unprecedented scale. In order to fulfill its fundamental duty of maintaining international peace and security, the Security Council must devise effective strategies to navigate the complexities and overcome its inherent constraints. As a non-permanent member of the Security Council, the Republic of Korea reaffirms its unwavering support for and active participation in the Council's work to this end with a renewed sense of urgency. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Cho, for his statement, and I will now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ignacio Cassis, Federal Councillor and Head of the Federal Department of Foreign Affairs of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Secretary General, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It is crucial that this Council continues to reflect on ways to restore peace and to put an end to the Russian war against Ukraine. And this with Ukraine. And I would like to greet Mr. Zelenskyy today. I firmly believe in the importance of respecting the United Nations Charter, international humanitarian law, and the application of the Geneva Conventions whose 75th anniversary we are celebrating this year. And yet, despite all the tools established since the Second World War, we have not succeeded in silencing the weapons. We have not been able to prevent countless civilians from suffering the consequences. Ladies and gentlemen, until now, this Council has not fully assumed its responsibility. After 1,000 days of war, we have still not found a diplomatic solution. Why are we unable to agree on the path to peace? Have we lost the common grammar of peace? I am in this position myself because I believe in the power of politics to serve the common good. We should always question the maxim of the strategist von Clausewitz, who said war must not be, and I quote, the mere continuation of politics by other means. Your Excellencies, it takes courage to make peace. By organizing the first summit on peace in Ukraine last June, Switzerland was courageous enough to put peace on the international agenda in the midst of war. Countries from 5 continents met near Lucerne to discuss three key issues in the building of peace. 1, nuclear safety, 2, food security, and 3, the humanitarian dimension of the conflict. The joint communiqué issued at Bürgenstock, signed by a majority of participants from all over the world, helped to alleviate some of the stumbling blocks revealed by the war in Ukraine and to restore the beginnings of trust between us. This first step towards peace must be followed by others. It is now essential to continue this dialogue with Russia as well. Only pragmatic diplomacy can get us out of this impasse, which has already cost too many lives. Ladies and gentlemen, while peace must be our priority, the reconstruction of Ukraine is also a collective responsibility. Lasting peace will also depend on well-prepared reconstruction. Switzerland laid the foundations for this reconstruction right from the start of the conflict with the Lugano Conference. One of our priorities is humanitarian demining. We are currently investing $120 million in demining civilian and agricultural areas in Ukraine. The Ukraine Mine Action Conference, co-organized by Switzerland and Ukraine in a few weeks' time on the 17th and 18th of October in Switzerland, will discuss the needs and solutions for this action. Ukraine is about to face its 3rd winter of war. It is our duty to finally offer the Ukrainian people a spring of peace. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Cassis for his statement, and I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Hugh Hilton Todd, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Please accept my commendations for Slovenia's efficient handling of the Council's business this month. I also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his sobering briefing on the ongoing war in Ukraine. And I also welcome President Zelenskyy to this meeting. Mr. President, next month will mark 79 years since the entry into force of the United Nations Charter. A charter that binds, and I quote, "we the peoples of the United Nations," end of quote, to the collective pursuit of peace, the promotion of human rights, and the advancement of social and economic progress. In choosing to join the United Nations and accepting the obligations of its charter, we each agreed to be bound by all of its provisions, including the prohibition on the use of force, enshrined in Article 2.4. This prohibition is one of the Charter's most explicit provisions and the foremost fundamental principle of international law. It demands that every member state of this organization refrain in its international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of another state. 79 years later, we find ourselves confronted with conflicts and crises that challenge the most basic tenets of the Charter and the realization of our collective desire for peace. Most notable is the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, which has already claimed the lives of over 11,000 civilians. Guyana deplores the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state and joins the international community in calling for full respect for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We reiterate that the principles of the respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, the prohibition on the use of threat or use of force, and the peaceful resolution of all disputes must be adhered to by all member states of the United Nations. The war in Ukraine continues to cause widespread suffering and destruction and is characterized by an almost wanton disregard for international law, including international humanitarian law. It has also had a detrimental impact on nuclear safety, energy security, the environment, and global food security. In both Ukraine and Russia, civilians continue to bear the brunt of the conflict, with many having paid the ultimate price. The resulting humanitarian situation has reached crisis level, with 40% of Ukraine's population now in desperate need for humanitarian assistance and over 10 million displaced. Any further escalation of the conflict will no doubt have even more dire consequences for both countries, the wider region, and the world. Guyana reiterates its call for the parties to the conflict to comply fully with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. We also call on the Russian Federation to allow full, unhindered humanitarian access to the people in need in the temporarily occupied territories. Mr. President, in seeking a path to lasting peace, Guyana would like to underscore the following 3 points. First, we wish to emphasize that this conflict cannot be solved through military means. Only a serious political and diplomatic process can pave the path to peace. Guyana commends the efforts of those who have committed to finding pathways to peacefully ending the war and stresses the need for this to be a collective endeavor. We therefore encourage further intensification of diplomatic dialogue with the conflict parties toward the de-escalation of hostilities and in the pursuit of sustainable peace. Second, respect for the provisions of the UN Charter and international law must be upheld. The acquisition of territory by force must not be condoned in any way, either individually or collectively. Every state must be able to pursue its national development without an unnecessary and expensive burden of having to arm itself in defense and its sovereignty and territorial integrity. My third and final point is that for the bells of peace to ring, the drums of war must be silenced. In this respect, Guyana reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the internationally recognized territory of Ukraine and end its invasion of Ukraine. This can be the first step towards finding a lasting and sustainable peace. President, Excellencies, as we prepare to mark the 79th anniversary of the entry into force of the United Nations Charter on the 24th of October, let us use the opportunity to reaffirm our commitment to its purposes, principles, and to international law. Let us also reaffirm the primacy of international cooperation and diplomacy in preventing conflicts and settling disputes. We, the peoples, deserve no less. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Todt, for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister of Foreign Affairs and National Community abroad of Algeria.
أشكركم سيد الرئيس.
Thank you, President. I would like to congratulate you upon your presidency of the Council. We would like to thank you for your stewardship, your effective stewardship of our work. We are gathered here today at a time when war is still raging in Ukraine and is spilling over into the third year without there being a horizon for a solution, a prospect of a solution on the horizon, and without any progress seeming to have been made to contain the effects and the repercussions of this conflict. We regret the fact that the lack of international inclusive initiatives and the lack of diplomatic avenues for peace to prevail seems to have become synonymous with this conflict, with its complications. At a time when the situation seems to confirm that we should absolutely not accept the status quo and should not accept the stumbling blocks that exist, whatever they may be, and not accept the difficulties. We are deeply convinced that the subject on our agenda today cannot in any way allow us to accept the repercussions of this war, because it has led to significant damage in terms of human lives and the destruction of property and resources for both parties, Russian and Ukrainian. It has paved the way for a human tragedy in all senses of the world. The war has pushed the whole of Europe into an open crisis, the most serious crisis, open to all kinds of complications, and the most serious since the end of the Second World War. The effects of this war are being felt in the entire world. And the repercussions of this war are still being felt. This, bearing in mind the fact that this is the most serious crisis that our collective security system has faced. And we have also seen major polarization in international relations that are going hand in hand with this crisis. We are seeing the effects of this throughout the world. And this is what led His Excellency, the President of Algeria, Mr. Abdelrashid Tebboune, this is what led him to propose mediating between the two parties. The goal being to build on the basis of friendly relations, which links us to both of these countries and which are deeply found on trust and common understanding and cooperation. The goal being to bring the parties together and to use peaceful means to resolve this conflict. My country has sincerely tried to use its good offices through the Arab Contact Group from the moment when the conflict erupted, because we are convinced, we are strongly convinced that in such a war there are no winners, there are only losers. As long as there are people who have died and people who have been displaced and infrastructure that has been destroyed and economies brought to their knees and regional and international security have been threatened, this is affecting people at all levels. We are also intimately convinced that the international community has the ability to put an end to this conflict if the appropriate conditions and environment are in place to allow for a diplomatic initiative to succeed, an initiative that can be to the agreement of all parties to the conflict and who would ultimately have to execute it. Hence, Algeria invites countries to step up their efforts to move towards constructive negotiations together. This path would focus on a peaceful solution to the conflict, because the solution can only be political and peaceful. This path would move the parties beyond the winners versus losers logic, because these countries are linked by a long history of interdependent relations. This path must be based on the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter and international law, because these principles and international law are the principles that must be respected between member states and which govern relations between states. This path would ultimately make it possible to address the root causes of the conflict as a whole and to heed the security concerns of both parties. This approach is the only way to guarantee a lasting solution. This is a solution that all countries can aspire to, all countries who wish to see stability between these two countries, above and beyond any other consideration, as is the case for my country. Thank you, President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Attar for his statement, and I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Musa Timothy Kaba, Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting to discuss the security situation in Ukraine at the request of 6 Council members. I thank the Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his comprehensive and sovereign briefing. I also join to welcome the participation of President Zelenskyy to today's meeting. As the war in Ukraine enters its 941st day, Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned about the continuous aerial attacks on heavily populated areas in cities and towns, causing untold suffering to civilians who find themselves trapped in this conflict. Sierra Leone takes note of the Ukraine letter of 19th September 2024, reporting on a guided aerial attack on a geriatric home in Sumi on the 19th of September, which was home to 221 elderly people, of whom more than 80 are bedridden, as well as 60 staff members. The attack reportedly killed one elderly person and injured at least 13 others. The facility suffered significant structural damage and 147 people had to be evacuated. The Russian Federation has similarly reported that there has been shelling on populated areas over the weekend in the Belgorod neighborhood in Russia and Russian-occupied areas in Ukraine, resulting in at least one civilian death and at least 14 injuries. We also take note of the Russian Federation's letter dated 20th September 2024, together with its enclosure detailing attacks on Russian civilians and civilian facilities. Mr. President, the humanitarian impact of the Ukraine conflict has been devastating, resulting in higher numbers of civilian deaths, injuries, and displacement. There has been reports of massive infrastructural damage to homes, schools, hospitals, and health facilities, businesses, and other civilian infrastructure from aerial strikes in Ukraine over the course of this year. Tragically, several first responders to these attacks also lost their lives and suffered injuries from repeated attacks on the same site. These attacks have also damaged critical water and electricity infrastructure, causing widespread disruptions in services in several areas. For example, according to OCHA, an estimated 16,000 people still residing in Pokrovstown have been without water and gas for weeks since both systems were destroyed from ongoing fighting. Attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are particularly heinous and are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, it is important for both parties to the conflict to de-escalate and prevent further harm to the lives and livelihoods of their citizens and other innocent civilians. Civilians in frontline communities have had to relocate several times, and humanitarian relief efforts are also being hindered by the extending and shifting front lines. In this regard, we call on the parties to the conflict to exercise maximum restraint. The continued escalation of this conflict presents a clear and present threat of not only drawing other countries in the region into the conflict, but also the possibility of triggering a nuclear catastrophe with an unintended strike on a nuclear facility, all of which will cause irreversible damage to efforts to bring the conflict to an end. Failure to take necessary action towards a political solution for the peaceful resolution of the conflict also presents the Council as ineffective and indifferent in achieving its mandate and addressing the suffering of millions of men, women, and children. Mr. President, the international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of an amicable and sustainable peace in Ukraine. It is equally important for this Council to speak with one voice in the interest of global peace and security and intensify efforts to mediate between the two conflicting parties, as well as encourage measures geared towards de-escalation and cessation of the hostilities and peaceful resolution of the conflict. In closing, Sierra Leone once more calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities, respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of both Ukraine and the Russian Federation within their internationally recognized borders, and for genuine diplomatic efforts to achieve a peaceful and lasting solution to the conflict, taking into account the legitimate concerns of all parties involved. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Kaba for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. David Lemmy, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom.
Well, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Secretary General, for your briefing on the grim realities of this war. President Zelenskyy, the UK commends you not only for standing up for your people, but for standing up for democracy. Seeing you in Kyiv a few weeks ago with Secretary Blinken, I saw ordinary people from all walks of life, the soldiers and the civilians, the firefighters and the first responders, the mothers and the fathers, working together in defence of freedom. Your bravery and courage is an inspiration to us all. But, Mr. President, I also want to speak directly to the Kremlin and its representative here today. And Vladimir Putin, Russia sits on this council, but its actions tear up the UN Charter. Russia sits on this council, but over the weekend we saw it put forward amendments designed to wreck the UN's future. Russia claims to stand for the global south, but it runs roughshod over international law. Vladimir Putin, when you fire missiles into Ukraine hospitals, we know who you are. When you send mercenaries into African countries, we know who you are. When you murder opponents in European cities, we know who you are. Your invasion is in your own interests, yours alone, to expand your mafia state into a mafia empire, an empire built on corruption, robbing from the Russian people as well as Ukraine, an empire built on crushing dissent, courageous opponents like Navalny, an empire built on lies, spreading disinformation at home and abroad to sow disorder. Mr. President, I speak not only as a Briton, as a Londoner, and as a Foreign Secretary, but I say to the Russian representative on his phone as I speak that I stand here also as a black man whose ancestors were taken in chains from Africa at the barrel of a gun to be enslaved, whose ancestors rose up and fought in a great rebellion of the enslaved. Imperialism, I know it when I see it, and I will call it out for what it is. In this week, when I'm here talking to other partners around the world about our shared futures and the future of the UN, Russia is trying to return us to a world of the past, a world of imperialism, a world of redrawing borders by force, a world without the UN Charter. We cannot allow this to happen. Ukraine's fight matters to all of us. The UK will remain Ukraine's staunchest supporter because, Mr. President, these are the stakes. If we let an imperialist redraw borders by force, those will not be the last borders to be redrawn. If we let an imperialist deny a nation its path, Ukraine will not be the last state to be subjected. Maduro will take encouragement and go for Guyana next. So let me be clear. We want peace in Ukraine. We want it for the Ukrainian people. As President Zelenskyy has said, it must be a peace that respects the fundamental principles that underpin the United Nations, the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, as enshrined in this UN Charter, the Charter of the United Nations. Putin's Russia wants to unravel it. We want to uphold it, and we will. As President Zelenskyy said, the UN Charter will prevail. Slava Ukraini.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lemmy for his statement and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Yakohori Takeshi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
Mr. President, I thank you and the delegation of Slovenia for organizing this important meeting. More than 2.5 years have passed since Russia launched its brutal aggression against Ukraine. Japan again condemns Russia's aggression in the strongest possible terms and repeatedly demands its withdrawal from Ukraine. First and foremost, please allow me, on behalf of the government of Japan, to pay tribute to and express solidarity with President Zelenskyy and the Ukrainian people, who have been fighting to uphold the inalienable principles of the UN Charter for the political independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of their country since the start of the aggression. Today, Japan reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine. As the aggression continues and civilian casualties mount day by day, Russia's attacks targeting critical infrastructure such as hospitals, schools, and power plants are threatening the future of the Ukrainian people. Russia must uphold its obligations under international humanitarian law. Deliberate and indiscriminate attacks on civilian targets are in flagrant violation of international law and constitute war crimes. Japan condemns Russia's illegal abduction of children who should bear the future of Ukraine. We strongly urge Russia to release all persons unjustly detained and to safely return all civilians illegally transferred or deported. The damaging impacts of Russia's war of aggression go well beyond Ukraine. In addition to the mass displacement of people from Ukraine, we are witnessing the dire consequences of food and energy insecurity, particularly in vulnerable and developing countries. Japan commits to protecting the human dignity of those made vulnerable due to the conflict, including women and children, and to continue its support to them. It is unacceptable that a permanent member of the Security Council, on which the UN Charter confers the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, is continuing to disregard international law by attempting to unilaterally change the status quo by force. In fact, Russia has violated Security Council resolutions it had voted in favor of by procuring ballistic missiles from North Korea and using them against Ukraine. In addition, we are deeply concerned about Iran's transfer of ballistic missiles to Russia. All UN member states must refrain from aiding Russia's aggression directly or indirectly. Furthermore, Japan condemns Russia's seizure and continued control and militarization of the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant. As the only country to have ever suffered atomic bombings during the war, Japan does not accept Russia's nuclear threats, let alone its use of nuclear weapons. In order to protect the international order based on the rule of law, it is essential to achieve a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine based on the principles of the UN Charter. The overwhelming majority of the international community shares this view. The only country worthy of blame for the present situation of Ukraine is Russia. UN member states, including the members of the Security Council, should make it clear that it was Russia that started this unjustified war of aggression. The rule of law is indispensable for multilateralism, and the United Nations should embody multilateralism. For this cause, all nations must fulfill their responsibilities to strengthen the governance of the United Nations. In order to reflect the realities of the 21st century and effectively maintain international peace and security, strengthening the functions of the United Nations, including through Security Council reform, is necessary. Japan is determined to continue exercising leadership to this end. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a country determined to seriously contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security, Japan once again strongly calls on Russia to immediately, completely, and unconditionally withdraw from Ukraine. Japan will stand with Ukraine so that peace and justice prevail. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Akahori for his statement. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Manuel Gonçalves, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Cooperation of Mozambique.
Mr. President, I wish to thank Slovenia Presidency for convening this high-level briefing on the security situation in Ukraine. We wish also to thank the Secretary General for his statement and for convening the urgency of the situation in Ukraine. As the conflict in Ukraine approaches its 3rd year, we observe with deep concern that armed hostilities continue to prevail over calls for peace, and the situation remains dire with significant humanitarian impacts. The international community remains apprehensive about the potential for wider conflict in Europe. There is a growing sense of unease regarding the escalation of tension. It is imperative to acknowledge that the world faces a critical juncture where we risk failing in our commitment, I quote, to save succeeding generations for the scars of war, end of quote. The potential consequence of such failure could surpass the devastation witnessed in previous global conflicts. Mr. President, we convene today in wake of a landmark adoption of the Pact of the Future. However, we must recognize that if immediate action is not taken to solve the conflicts, the future will seek to secure for subsequent generations may be imperiled not only for Ukraine, but globally. This conflict between the two nations with an intertwined history and kinship has placed considerably a strain on our global architecture for peace and security, as well as on our shared principle of humanity. Against this backdrop, as we stand at the crossroad of history, confronted with the sober reality of war and the threat of global conflict, it is crucial to reaffirm the fundamental values that bind us. We strongly advocate for primacy for resolved dialogue, to reasoned dialogue of the use of force. Our collective strength and hope for peace lie in our unwavering commitment to diplomacy, the principle of ensuring in UN Charter, international law, and mechanisms for peaceful resolution of disputes. Mr. President, drawing from our national historical experience, we affirm that the use of force invariably leads to destruction. Such actions exacerbate divisions, fuel resentment, and inflict untold suffering on the most vulnerable members of our society. It is our firm belief that violence, regardless of its justification by any part, cannot establish the condition necessary for lasting peace. It is through reasoned dialogue, patient, principled approach, and determined pursuit of justice and mutual understanding that we can build the foundation of a world where the future generations are safeguarded from the threat of armed conflict. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine serves as the stark reminder of the fragility of peace and the immense responsibility we bear to protect it. We are confronted daily with alarming risk of escalation, including unimaginable aspect of nuclear confrontation. We must therefore categorically reject the temptation of counter force with force. Instead, we must rely behind the very principles that have guided us for over 7 decades. respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and peaceful resolution of disputes. Let us reaffirm the solemn commitment made by founders of these institutions to succeed generation from scratch for the war. This is not an abstraction. It is our collective responsibility and mission. It calls upon each member state to transcend immediate political consideration, to act with reason and restraint, and to recognize that our shared humanity surpasses any reflecting potential gain. Together, we must redouble our effort to facilitate peace, foster dialogue, and support every initiative that seeks to end hostility and restore hope. Mr. President, tomorrow this chamber will convene for an open debate on maintenance of international peace and security, focused on the theme leadership for peace. We must remain vigilant against the perils of hubris in leadership and heed the call we collectively endorsed in the Pact for the Future to guarantee a better future for current and future generations. Let us, guided by noble task for ensuring that the legacy we leave behind is one of peace, stability, and dignity for all. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Gonçalves for his statement and give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jaime Barberis, Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs of Ecuador.
Señor Presidente.
President, I begin by thanking Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his tireless efforts for peace, and I recognize the presence here of senior officials in this chamber, whom my delegation has listened to and will continue to listen to respectfully. I appear before this Council with a deep sense of responsibility and mindful of the state of fragility in which global peace and security finds itself. The war in Ukraine, whose impact continues to cause human suffering and growing global instability, once again raises questions about this Council's credibility and ability to fulfill its primary responsibility to uphold international peace and security. The United Nations Charter remains the beacon that should guide us towards achieving lasting global peace. Its purposes and principles remind us of the need to avoid the mistakes and horrors of the past. It is our collective responsibility to defend it. I reaffirm my country's unwavering commitment to the fundamental principles of international law. Respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and the political independence of states is non-negotiable. Paragraph 4 of Article 2 of the Charter is crystal clear, and there is no provision whatsoever that admits or legitimizes the use or threat of use of force as a way of resolving disputes between nations. That is why, since the conflict erupted in February 2022, my country has maintained a strong, coherent position in line with international law and the UN Charter. We condemned the invasion of Ukraine, and we have consistently supported the resolutions adopted by the UN General Assembly, as well as the provisional measures against the Russian Federation by the ICJ in March 2022. President, the communities affected by the conflict are facing an unprecedented humanitarian crisis. Attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure continue to devastate people's lives and to destroy means of survival, including beyond Ukraine's borders. Ecuador has called on both parties to protect civilians, to move fighting away from populated areas, to safeguard civilian infrastructure, and to adhere to the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution as international humanitarian law stipulates. In addition to this, my country has called for the implementation of Resolution 2730 and those pertaining to the protection of humanitarian personnel and the United Nations personnel. Facilitating unhindered access for humanitarian aid to all areas and to those affected is of critical importance. President, the impact of this conflict is not limited to the borders of Ukraine and Russia. The economic, energy and food-related consequences of the war are affecting developing countries, compromising global efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. We should also bear in mind the risk that this war spills over into a broader conflict. The intensification of hostilities threatens to bring us to a state of confrontation which would have unfathomable consequences. Given this, the UN Secretary-General's call for there to be an end to hostilities and the efforts of international actors to put an end to this conflict must be supported. I reiterate Ecuador's availability and willingness to support all initiatives to restore peace and security in Ukraine and in the wider region. Dialogue and diplomacy cannot be viewed as red lines. President, Your Excellencies, Ecuador's experience has shown that even the most long-standing conflicts can be solved through dialogue and diplomacy. Although we are well aware of how complex the situation in Ukraine is and of the geopolitical tensions surrounding it, it is this experience that leads us to the belief that we can find a solution for peace in Ukraine. This Council has the historic responsibility to contribute to the quest for peaceful solutions, rejecting the use of force as a way of resolving disputes and working for a world in which collective security prevails. That is why, to conclude, Ecuador joins the call for the Russian Federation to end its military operations in Ukraine so that we can move without further delay towards a negotiated solution, towards a sustainable peace based on international law and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Barberis for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, the rhetoric, the highfalutin rhetoric of the British foreign minister, who lectured us about imperialism, who did we hear? Who would we have heard this from? I would recommend that you read our amendment to the Pact for the Future, which is based on Article 2.7 of the United Nations Charter. Let him begin with reading it and then describing what he does not accept there. Perhaps the reference to the Charter of the UN? Indeed, he has already departed, but I do hope that this will be conveyed to him. Mr. President, today, before our very eyes, absolutely horrific, inhumane military campaign is underway. The UN Secretary General in early October described it as follows, and I quote, throughout my entire mandate as the Secretary General, I never saw such levels of suffering, casualties, and devastation as was seen in recent months, unquote. This conflict has already claimed the lives of nearly 42,000 people, including more than 300 humanitarian personnel. The territory where 2 million people live now lies in ruins and is now uninhabitable and will remain uninhabitable for many years and possibly decades. Antonio Guterres previously called this area a children's graveyard because so many women and children perished there. And despite all of this, the United Nations Security Council has, for nearly 1 year, not been able to achieve a ceasefire there, which all humanitarian workers and humanitarian personnel have been calling for, all barring none. And this is due to the position of a single permanent member of the Security Council, who, for the sake of this, cast a veto 5 times. I think it is clear to all that we are not talking about Ukraine, we are talking about the crisis in Gaza. For the distinction between them to be even starker, suffice it to recall that 1 year ago, after the start of the Israeli operation in the Strip, several thousand Israelis of Ukrainian origin arrived in Ukraine. They decided that they would be safer there in Ukraine. For the residents of Ukraine are perfectly aware of the fact that Russia is not carrying out strikes on civilian objects if they are not being used for military purposes. And all such incidents that are referred to by the Ukrainian authorities occurred due to the operations of Ukrainian air defense systems and the fact that they're being deployed in residential areas in Ukrainian cities. Under these circumstances, it is clear why the whole world expected that the Security Council would convene eminent guests in New York specifically to discuss the situation in Gaza, especially given that the tectonic shifts that they have created are threatening to plunge the entire Middle East region from Lebanon to Iran and Yemen into a large-scale, brutal regional conflict. Only in the past 2 days, Israeli strikes claimed the lives of nearly 600 Lebanese. However, Western members of the Security Council previously booked this chamber in advance specifically for the PR benefit of the expired Ukrainian president. And were it not for Arab countries and developing countries who requested a meeting to be held on 27 September, the Security Council simply would not have discussed Gaza at all during this week. All of this appears even more unseemly for the Security Council, given that everything that is transpiring around Ukraine is perfectly clear to all of us. Here's a brief recap for all of you. The Kiev regime, which came to power as a result of a coup which was instigated by the West in 2014, immediately unleashed a brutal civil war against those unwilling to renounce their identity, unwilling to bow to Nazi collaborators, and I refer to the residents of the West and East of the country. And as a result of this, the Maidan authorities almost immediately lost Crimea. And at that point, in 2015, this conflict was frozen with the signing of the Minsk package of measures, which was approved by the United Nations Security Council. However, the new Ukrainian authorities, instead of implementing this document, took great pains to sabotage it, and they feverishly armed themselves and prepared for war with Russia with the assistance of the U.S. and their allies. And this was recognized by a number of Western politicians who have since left the stage. After the regime in Kiev categorically refused to implement the Minsk agreements, and the Western sponsors thereof rebuffed any dialogue with Russia on European security issues, our country, having come face-to-face with the significant uptick in Ukrainian strikes targeting peaceful cities in the Republic of Donbass, decided to begin our special military operation. This could have begun 1 month in, when the Russian army was at the outskirts of Kiev. However, the West dissuaded Kiev's strongmen from signing the draft peace agreement, which was initialed by Ukraine in Istanbul, promising to do everything possible to support the Ukrainian army, which allegedly in this case would be able to inflict defeat on Russia on the battlefield. However, despite the bountiful deliveries of weapons, including long-range weapons, deliveries of intelligence information, targeting, the deployment of mercenaries and instructors, and the effectively the Western direct participation in the conflict with the aim of inflict a strategic defeat on Russia with the hands of the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian army today is at the verge of complete collapse. In order to see this and be persuaded of this, it suffices to read military communiques, which show the swift destruction of Kiev's fortification lines on the Eastern Front, which were erected over the course of 8 years. To have the full picture, there's also a need to take into account that the selection of new recruits, which the Zelenskyy regime is throwing to certain death in the senseless meat grinder, is being carried out almost exclusively with the use of force when people are being rounded up. And this is shown in videos which appalled Ukrainian citizens have posted and flooded the Ukrainian internet landscape with. In other words, the Ukrainians do not wish to go to war. They're doing everything possible to attempt to flee the country, and those who find themselves on the front without being appropriately trained are attempting either to desert or to surrender. And were it not for the barrier troops of deranged nationalists firing at their backs, the number of prisoners would have been in the tens of thousands. And for this same reason, the notorious counteroffensive, last year's notorious counteroffensive, failed, upon which the Zelensky's sponsors and his clique pinned such great hopes. Understanding all of this, the head of the Kiev junta has decided to make use of the sole remaining chance to cling to power and to avoid reprisals from his own compatriots, namely by dragging the West into a direct confrontation with Russia. A large-scale provocation such as Bucha would have fit the bill. However, this was so clumsy, so unpersuasive, that it is clear that a new one would not be persuasive either. The other option would be to provoke a strong response after strikes with long-range Western weapons targeting objects deep within Russian territory, and then to cry wolf. However, Western leaders whose self-preservation instinct has not completely deteriorated have not yet taken this decision, or in any event, they are not eager to announce this. And for this reason, the Kiev strongman decided to go all in, and having lulled everybody with ruminations about peace, decided to engage in the reckless attack on peaceful Russian border regions. However, here too, things did not go as planned. He did not achieve his goals, and he was forced to spend valuable human resources and Western equipment, which was in short supply in Kursk Oblast at the time when the destruction and collapse of the Eastern Front is ongoing at an unprecedented tempo. And here he's in New York, once again with an extended hand, attempting to persuade the West to raise the stakes in the conflict with Russia and to throw their own sons to certain death in Ukraine, thereby becoming direct party to the conflict with a nuclear power. Zelenskyy does not have anything to lose, but the U.S. and allies naturally do. And they are perfectly aware of the cost that they could pay for such an attempt to save the Ukrainian deadweight, the suitcase without handles. Mr. President, now the actor, Vladimir Zelenskyy, is playing a role of the cool guy, the West's ally, and something even of a savior of all humankind against the Russian threat. He has close ties with notorious Russophobes and fervent nationalists who imbibed with their mother's milk the ideas of Bandera and other Hitlerite henchmen. However, the character before us far from always played this role. To understand who we are dealing with, let's consider briefly his political persona over the past decade. In the past, before being elected president, and at the initial stage of the leadership of the country, Mr. Zelenskyy was actually quite critical about the coup in 2014. He called for an objective investigation into its dark chapters. Himself a Russian language speaker, in 2014, he uttered the following words, and I quote, "If in the east of Ukraine and Crimea people wish to speak in Russian, back off, let them be. Let them speak in Russian lawfully. Language will never divide our motherland," end of quote. At the height of his election campaign in 2014, he announced that the oppression of the Russian language was unacceptable. He spoke of the need to guarantee that the Russian language develop on equal footing with others. Furthermore, he promised to ensure a lasting ceasefire in Donbass. It is hardly surprising that this program was appreciated by Ukrainian voters, and he received 3/4 of their votes. Naturally, the fact that he gave interviews in Russia also had an effect. He promised not to impose a cult of Nazi henchmen on those who do not regard them as heroes, and he promised that he would force a silencing of weapons in the east of the country, where the Ukrainian armed forces had for 5 years by that time been shelling peaceful cities, murdering women, the elderly, and children. However, after the presidential victory, he began to play a different role and failed to meet a single one of his promises, to honor a single one of his promises. We can see how he gradually betrayed the Ukrainian people and destroyed their statehood for the advancement of the interests of Western sponsors. In his inaugural speech, he announced that the Ukrainian state needs to fight for the hearts and souls of the people of Donbass, not just for territory. Soon after assuming the oath of office, he began to sabotage the implementation of the Minsk agreements. He supported myriad extremist laws against the Russian language and Russian speakers, and then simply advised that the residents of southeast Ukraine who view themselves as Russians to move to Russia. He called them specimens. And we would like to ask Mr. Zelenskyy, it won't be possible since he has left, who today called for respect for the Charter of the United Nations. How are these actions in accordance with the Charter of the UN? How is it in accordance with the violations of basic human rights which have been carried out by the leadership of that state? Or are you ready to note that in that document only those parts that pertain to territorial integrity? Instead of eliminating the root causes of the internal crisis in Ukraine, which triggered the civil war, the new president of Ukraine decided to exacerbate it. In the country, essentially, a language inquisition was unleashed with punishments for the use of the Russian language, which is the mother tongue of the majority of Ukrainians. Even before Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, the opposition was effectively destroyed. Independent media outlets were shuttered. The canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church was repressed. Nationalist and neo-nationalist groups flourished. Anything that in any way, in one way or another, linked Ukraine to Russia was effectively made illegal. History was rewritten. Children were indoctrinated with delusional theories about thousands-year-old Ukrainian civilization from which Jews and Portuguese and French originated. This is not a joke. It is not a fake. This is written in geography books for the 8th class in a Ukrainian middle school, and we showed it here in this chamber. Mr. President, in the West's battle cries, Ukraine is portrayed as some kind of an innocent victim of Russia's aggression, and the United States and allies are portrayed as peacekeepers. Nothing is further from the truth than these assertions. Ukraine, under the neo-Nazi Kiev regime, became a one-man dictatorship, willing, for the sake of preserving his power and blind obedience to the West, not just to drown his whole country in blood and to sacrifice all young Ukrainians who were unable to flee the country, but also willing to push the world into the abyss of a third world war. And just a few years ago, Mr. Zelenskyy said the following, and I quote, "I can assure you, for our heroes to not die any longer, I am willing to do anything, and I certainly am not afraid of taking difficult decisions. Without hesitation, I am willing to leave my post, if only for the advent of peace," unquote. Now these words appear to be from the realm of fantasy. That is how irrelevant they have become. Given the dismally low levels of support for him from his population, he has an animal fear of being stripped of power because he understands that he will be held accountable for all the crimes which he perpetrated during his presidency. Let us recall, regular elections were scheduled to be held on 31 March, but Zelenskyy canceled them under the pretext of a state of war, and this runs counter to the basic law of the country. After 20 May, this year, when the presidential powers should have, according to the Constitution, been transferred to the Speaker of the Upper Rada, the head of the Kiev junta, transformed into a conventional usurper of power. On the 28th of August, the authorities of the 9th session of the Rada expired, incidentally. In the 5 years of his presidential term, he brought the country entrusted to him to an abyss, having sold off Ukraine to Western corporations, having destroyed its economy, and having plunged it into a horrific demographic crisis. President Biden today at the General Assembly spoke about the need to save the Ukrainian nation. The Ukrainian nation is not threatened with anything. We are not fighting against it. We are fighting against a criminal regime which seized power in Kyiv, which is bringing its people towards catastrophe. And this is not a war for territory, regardless of the claims of our foes. This is a struggle for acknowledgement and people's rights. Mr. President, a just and lasting resolution to the Ukrainian crisis is only possible if the root causes are eradicated. First and foremost, with an end to violations of the rights of Russian language people and a repeal in Ukraine of other discriminatory laws. Today, we hear from many corners, we hear calls for a political diplomatic solution on the basis of the UN Charter. However, without overcoming the legacy of Maidan, without eradicating nationalism, Nazism, and other manifestations of discrimination in Ukraine, respect for the rights and basic freedoms of all without distinction as to race, gender, language, and religion, in accordance with Article 1.3 of the Charter of the United Nations, there will be no resolution. It would not be possible. And yet, we have not heard about this either from our Western colleagues or from the UN Secretary General, nor did we hear from them another important premise, namely that the purposes and the principles of the Charter of the United Nations need to be complied with fully in their integrity and interrelated nature. Beyond provisions about respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity of states, there's also the principle there of self-determination of peoples, and this under no circumstances can be overlooked, nor should the responsibility of states for all of its citizens, the citizens of their state, be overlooked either. We hope that the Kyiv regime will not be able to completely destroy their country and their people, which they're close to doing, nor push the world into the abyss of nuclear catastrophe. For that, they should embrace realistic parameters for a long-term resolution to the Ukrainian crisis rather than falling back on unrealistic ultimatums, victory plans, and so on. The cost, the price for such criminal, flippant arrogance is paid by ordinary Ukrainians whose resistance to the high-handed Ukrainian Kyiv clique is visibly growing. The Russian Federation was always ready to live in peace and good neighborly relations with Ukraine until it was shaped into aggressive, Russophobic, neo-Nazi wasp's nest, threatening our security, and before the design of plans to drag it into a the militaristic NATO bloc. We always respect Ukrainians. These are a brotherly people with whom we are tied with unbreakable historic ties. Millions of them found shelter in Russia. If the Western camp does not abandon this, does not excise this cancerous tumor of the current Kyiv regime peacefully, if Washington and satellites geopolitical economic considerations do not continue to supersede the salvation of the country, we will continue our SMO until its objectives are met militarily, and there is no other way towards peace. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. Before continuing, please let me read this time limit reminder. This meeting needs to conclude by 6 p.m. I would like to remind all the speakers that there is a time limit of 3 minutes in place to be able to conclude the meeting within the allotted time frame. You may send your full statement for publication as an official Security Council document with a letter addressed to the President. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Gitanas Nausėda, President of the Republic of Lithuania.
Your Excellency, Prime Minister of the Republic of Slovenia, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor to speak on behalf of the three Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We came here to discuss maintaining peace and security of Ukraine. Before turning our attention to the future, I suggest that we also talk about the past and the present. Ukraine had been perfectly secure from external threats before this security was snatched away. Before the illegal occupation of Crimea, before the invasion into Donbass, before the whole-scale war of aggression in 2022. Right now, Ukraine has neither peace nor security. And it is Russia, a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, that is directly responsible for putting not only European, but global peace and security under threat. Let me remind you that this great organization was created to prevent both wars of aggression and war crimes. The peoples of the United Nations determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. That is how the United Nations Charter begins. And we continue to fulfill that promise to this very day. It is truly the shame that Russia is still able to hide behind the veto power and actively uses this power to cover crimes of its partners. Each and every person in this room knows about Kremlin's many crimes. I won't repeat the whole list now. What the Baltic states demand is accountability. The whole political and military leadership of Russia must be held accountable, as well as their major accomplices. Special international tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine must be established. War criminals must be arrested under ICC arrest warrants by the countries that have ratified the Rome Statute. The Baltic states acknowledge that there will be no true accountability without Ukraine's decisive victory. Peace can only be achieved through the full restoration of Ukraine's territory within its internationally recognized borders. Security can only be guaranteed by Russia's acknowledgement that it will never prevail over the brave Ukrainian people. Therefore, it is the duty of the international community to support Ukraine for as long as it takes, until its final victory. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency President Nauseda for his statement. And now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Luminița Teodora Odobescu, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Romania.
Thank you. Mr. President, Russia's aggression against Ukraine undermines with every passing day the effective and rules-based multilateralism with UN at its core. We are here today in the Security Council to stand by our neighbor Ukraine, by the UN Charter and international law, and echo again that there is only one way to end the aggression against Ukraine. Here is how. Russia must abide the rules of international law. It must unconditionally cease the use of force and withdraw completely and immediately from the territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. Ukraine's independence, territorial integrity, and its sovereign right to freely choose its own pathway should be respected by all UN member states. Ukraine has the legitimate right to defend itself against the Russian aggression. During the current illegal military aggression, innocent civilians were killed. Furthermore, Russia has been using a wide array of war techniques, from irresponsible threat of the nuclear option and disinformation to the destruction of energy infrastructure and violating the basic principle of freedom of navigation. The recent strike by Russia against a cargo ship loaded with Ukrainian grain in the Black Sea represents another example of its aggressive actions in the region. Romania will continue to remain committed to enhance the transit capacity of Ukrainian goods via its Danube and Black Sea ports. In these grave circumstances, we have to make sure that justice is being served and accountability is duly pursued for all crimes committed against Ukraine, including the crime of aggression. The ongoing war is severely affecting the security of the wider Black Sea area, challenging the resilience of the neighboring states. We recall that Republic of Moldova's stability is critical for the entire region. Mr. President, peace in Ukraine cannot be restored by inaction. Romania tirelessly advocates for a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine in line with the UN Charter. Romania fully supports the peace formula of President Zelenskyy. One principle is crystal clear. Legally and morally, Ukraine alone has the political and moral legitimacy to decide if, when, and on what terms it wants to engage with the Russian Federation. What we wish for is simple and only natural: peace for the people of Ukraine and fully fledged respect for the UN Charter and the international law. This should be our joint objective and responsibility. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Sodobescu for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Péter Szijjártó, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade of Hungary.
Madam Minister, dear Tanya, thank you so much for organizing this briefing. Dear colleagues, I'm representing a country which is a direct neighbor to Ukraine, a country which has been faced with the consequences of the war for the last 2.5 years, a country which has been paying the price of this war, although we do absolutely have no responsibility in this war being launched. After almost 1,000 days, I think the question is no more what we do think about the war, but the question is how peace will be made. Or even more precisely, Madam Minister, dear Chair, the question should read as which is the quickest way to peace. Because we do believe that we do have to reach peace in the fastest, in the quickest possible way. Because the later we come to peace, the more people will die, the more families will suffer, more people will have to escape, and the more destruction will take place. And we Hungarians in the neighborhood, we don't want more destruction to take place. We don't want more families to suffer. We don't want more people to die, especially that there's a significant community of Hungarians living in Ukraine. And if we are honest to ourselves, and if we don't use only panels of communication, then I think it's obvious that what has been done so far has not worked out at all from the perspective of peace. The weapon deliveries have absolutely not helped to bring this war closer to its conclusion. Weapon deliveries have absolutely not helped in bringing this war to an end. And the increase of the number of weapons on both sides of the front line ended up in more casualties and also the prolongation. And we are super concerned about the ever-growing risk of escalation, and we are absolutely concerned about the open references to the use of any type of nuclear weapons. We Hungarians argue in favor of ceasefire and peace talks to be started. We Hungarians do believe that this is the fastest way towards peace, especially that what has happened so far proves that there is no solution on the battlefield. What you have on the battlefield is casualties and destruction. And we Hungarians are proud to be among the global majority for peace, and we are ready to take part in all global initiatives which brings forward the hope for peace and strengthens the volume of peace. And we do hope that this high-level week of the General Assembly will bring us closer to the conclusion of the war, bring us closer to peace, and brings us closer to the end of the suffering of the people in our neighborhood. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Siarto for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Radoslaw Sikorski, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Poland.
Madam President, Excellencies, the Russian ambassador predicted that this debate will consist of, quote, hackneyed statements dictated by Brussels. It's a lie. I assure you that what you're about to hear, I wrote myself. The Russian ambassador claims that Russia does not bomb civilian targets. That's a second lie. 2 weeks ago, I visited the Ukrainian city of Lviv, where a townhouse was hit with a Russian Kalibr missile. This is the result. A man saw his wife and 3 daughters taken out of the rubble dead. All of them were civilians. All of them lived far away from the front line, and all of them were killed. The Russian ambassador has talked about children's graveyard in Gaza, which is indeed a tragic situation. Well, Ukrainian children are targeted not only with bombs. Thousands have been kidnapped and taken into Russia, where they are brainwashed in order to strip them of memories and of their national identity. Russia claims that these children are orphans, left alone in a war zone. Another lie. Many of them were separated from their parents, either by accident during attacks or deliberately by the aggressor's army. Independent reports revealed that, and I quote, officials have deported Ukrainian children to Russia or Russian-held territories without consent, lied to them that they weren't wanted by their parents, used them for propaganda, and given them Russian families and citizenship. Special camps offer the abducted children Russian patriotic education, and a hotline was established to pair the minors with potential foster families, in inverted commas, luring the latter with money. On top of that, Mr. Putin signed a decree fast-tracking the process of granting Russian citizenship to stolen Ukrainian children. This is not collateral war damage. It was a plan devised before the war and ruthlessly executed. UN investigators concluded that these actions constitute war crimes. In October 2022, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. Ambassador Nebenzia and Russian propagandists like to refer to the democratically elected government of Ukraine as Nazis, as you've just heard. It so happens that in Poland, I live three kilometers from Potulice, the site of a former Nazi filtration camp during the Second World War. It's known for the fact that thousands of children were imprisoned there, from Poland and the Soviet Union, from around Smolensk and Vitebsk. Up to 800 of these children died, but thousands were transferred west to be Germanized. Blonde, blue-eyed, Aryan children, deemed to be racially suitable. I therefore have a few questions to the Russian ambassador and his superiors. How does what you are doing to Ukrainian kidnapped children differ from what German Nazis did to your children and ours? How many Russian officials have adopted stolen Ukrainian children following, as reported by the BBC, the example of Sergei Mironov, former chairman of the Russian Federation Council? When will you return the remaining thousands of stolen Ukrainian children back to Ukraine? Do you know that stealing in other countries' children is tantamount to genocide, as recently reaffirmed by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe? Do you remember the diplomats and propagandists of a genocidal regime are also criminals, as Soviet prosecutors argued at Nuremberg with reference to Ribbentrop and Streicher. Permanent members of the UN Security Council are supposed to be guardians of peace and not to fight their wars with other people's children. This is Russia's shame that will not be forgiven or forgotten. And by the way, since Ambassador Nebenzia denies the reality of Soviet Nazi collaboration in the invasion of Poland in 1939, here are pictures of their joint parade. I'm sure you recognize the Soviet uniforms. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Sikorski for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Juraj Blanar, Minister for Foreign and European Affairs of Slovakia.
Thank you, Madam President, Excellencies, dear colleagues. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to take the floor as a direct neighbor of Ukraine and deliver the key message on behalf of Slovakia. Now I would like to focus on 3 points. Firstly, to reiterate our principal position. Slovakia supports the sovereignty, independence and territorial integrity of Ukraine within its international recognized border as a matter of principle. Borders must be respected and cannot be changed by force. The sovereignty of all must be respected. These are key provisions of the UN Charter, essential for the global stability and predictability of international relations. Since we did not recognize the unilateral declaration of independence of Kosovo, we also do not recognize the annexation of Crimea region of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk and Zaporozhye. Secondly, on continued peace efforts. More than 2.5 years since the invasion, we have no firm commitment from global powers to the peace process. Divisions within this Council are deepening. Its role as a protector of peace is being questioned. Slovakia calls on all the stakeholders to put aside their differences and focus on stopping the human suffering and destruction of Ukraine. There is no alternative to dialogue, as the situation cannot be resolved by the military means alone. The war against Ukraine, as well as in Gaza, has dire global consequences for global food and energy security and the supply routes. And when we talk about the peace, we must be very specific. A lasting, just peace for Ukraine cannot be achieved outside of the key principles of the UN Charter. Slovakia stands ready to support any meaningful process or format for respects these principles. The process will determine the outcome. This conflict cannot be solved unless the competition of global powers is replaced by their cooperation and return to diplomacy. Let me finish this part of about the peace by using of the words of Albert Einstein. Peace cannot be kept by force. It cannot only be achieved by understanding. Thirdly, the future of Ukraine is in the European Union. My government supports a peaceful, independent, sovereign, democratic and prosperous Ukraine with a stable, internationally recognized borders and firmly advancing on its reform path towards future European Union membership. Yesterday, I spoke at the G7 Plus meeting about the continued support for Ukraine ahead of upcoming winter. We keep providing emergency volumes of electricity, gas and diesel fuel to minimize power and heat outages in Ukraine. People are our primary concern. To this end, the third joint meeting of the governments of Slovakia and Ukraine, Slovak and Ukraine governments will soon take place with the aim of speeding up the implementation of the roadmap signed by our prime ministers earlier this year, focusing on strategic infrastructure and connectivity. Slovakia remains engaged to provide solidarity to people in Ukraine as well as in Gaza and Sudan. Thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Blanard for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Josep Borrell, High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, we meet today as a permanent member of this Council. Russia continues carrying a brutal, unjustified and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. As many have said today, it's a blatant violation of the United Nations Charter. Russia launched a war against Ukraine. It is the first interstate war in Europe since World War II. And Ukraine defends itself in line with its right to self-defense under the United Nations Charter, and it does so against a nuclear-armed state. The international community must remain determined to support Ukraine's freedom, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized border. Some has declared here today that they love peace. Oh yes, they love peace. No one loves peace more than the Ukrainians. And they want peace quickly, the quickest possible way. But they haven't mentioned that the quickest possible way is Russia withdrawing their troops from Ukraine. This would be the quickest possible way. Yes, there is another way, Ukrainian surrender. But we don't want this kind of ending the war. And they are desolated because the fact that we have been providing support to Ukraine has not finished the war. No, but it has allowed Ukraine to defend itself. And we want Ukraine to continue defending itself. So to all lovers of peace, please take into consideration that it matters the way this war is going to end. It matters. And one way of ending this war, which is Ukrainian surrender in front of the violation of their territorial integrity, will be a good example for the perpetrator of this violation to start again and again. So please, my call to all peace lovers is to keep in mind that what we are talking about is about the freedom of one country, one people, who is defending itself against an aggressor. United Nations reports are unequivocal. The deliberate destruction of civilian homes and infrastructures, depriving the civilian population of services necessary for its survival, particularly when the winter season starts and 2/3 of electricity production capacity of the country has been destroyed. The recent transfer of short-range ballistic missiles by Iran to Russia, and in doing also with North Korea, is becoming an enabler of Russian aggression. And this represents a substantive material escalation and a direct threat to European security. These weapons will be likely used against Ukrainian civilians, adding another layer of suffering and destruction of this war. The European Union remains unwavering in its support for Ukraine and to a just and lasting peace, yes, because we want peace. We too want peace, but based on international law and the United Nations Charter, and do more than 110 partners who supported the summit joint communique of this last meeting on a peace framework supporting, again, sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of an aggressor country. At the end of the day, it's up to Ukraine, and only to Ukraine, to define the terms in which they want this war eventually end. And we need to pay more attention at the constant violations of the embargo against Russia. We need to be concerned by the circumvention of sanctions, that these, yes, are making the war longer. And we have to reinforce the legitimacy of our support to Ukraine by being consistent with our values and applying these values everywhere. This is the best way of supporting Ukraine. Consistency is of the essence. In a world that is becoming less multilateral and more transactional, and in order to prevent this slide toward more transactions and less norms, we need to work very hard. This is the best way to support Ukraine for a peace, a just peace, that makes the aggressor to fail. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Borrell for his statement. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Annalena Baerbock, Federal Minister for Foreign Affairs of Germany.
Thank you very much, Excellencies, colleagues, dear Madam President. 943 days ago, Russia launched its full-scale aggression against Ukraine. 943 days of suffering. 943 days of women being raped in Bucha, of tortured people in eastern Ukraine, and of children being deported. And as we have heard here today, there's no denying of that. Children being deported from their homes, as my Polish colleague has outlined. We heard here the Russian ambassador that he didn't even say this is not true. He said it's better for the children. There's an estimation that more than 20,000 children have been deported. Imagine these were your children, and you hear here in the Security Council that this is for the better good of your child, being stolen from you as a mother or a father. I had the chance to speak one of the very, very few teenager girls who could be returned. She was telling me in tears, please promise me one thing. You won't stop, you won't stay silent until all the other girls, all the other boys, the little children have been returned. And this is our promise we gave. We as European neighbors, we as Germans, my country, what we heard here from our Polish friends, who were responsible for the worst crime on the European continent, who are lucky to live in peace again, my generation to live in peace again, because others were there for us, other European friends and partners, that my country could live in peace, reunified in the middle of Europe. And this is also my plea to those where I totally understand, who ask us, can you please stop this? Maybe it would help if you do not support Ukraine in self-defense. Maybe we should just ignore what's happening. We cannot do that, because my country pledged that we always stand up for the principles of this united nation. And we won't rest until these children are being back to their families. And yes, the Russian Federation, the ambassador who always leaves after he has spoken here, I've experienced that a couple of times, you can fool yourself. The strongest man of your country can hide behind teenager girls who he kidnapped. But you cannot fool the world. I mean, we don't have to go through all the 943 days of all the atrocities. We can all just remember what happened on Sunday here in New York. Russia wanted to prevent us from a real breakthrough for the UN. When a vast majority of states rallied around the values of the Charter, The fooling of the world happened just then, when Russia wanted to prevent us from a real breakthrough for the UN. And then we can read it all on Twitter. Their truth is that the majority from the, I quote, jungle was not capable of taking the right decision. This is how Putin's Russia these days speaks about other countries, the jungle. This is how they speak about Ukraine, a beauty which has to be raped. And this is how Putin's soldiers, Putin's army behaves. Every day, 943 days. Lately, with heavy drone attacks and missiles directly targeted power plants. 2/3 of electricity and heating is being destroyed right now, even though we try to protect it with air defense. 2/3 being destroyed, not by coincidence, but because winter is coming again. Minus 15 degrees means that electricity doesn't work, heating doesn't work, and water is being frozen. This is a crime against humanity. People freezing to death. And this is why, again, I would like to call on all the friends around the world. We can totally understand that some of you think maybe if there is no weapon support anymore for Ukraine, maybe if we just call neutrally on all sides, this can go better. But I mean, the truth is, if there's no air defense left around the remaining electricity hubs, there's no electricity in Ukraine anymore. Then everything is being destroyed. And yes, we can call on both sides neutrally. But Vladimir Zelenskyy invited the Russian president to the negotiation table in summer. He offered a dialogue. And Vladimir Putin has responded with new levels of aggression. In June, Ukraine invited Russia to a second international peace conference. Putin's response? He bombed a children's hospital in Kiev. And this is why we believe we have to send further air defense to protect children's hospitals. And this is why we are on one hand very grateful that an increasing number of our partners in the world are thinking about how to end this war. We need this. We need an end to this war. But this cannot mean for us to stand by and watch while there is no end to this war, while Putin hasn't taken the seat at the negotiation table, to just stand by and watch Russia destroying the remaining half of Ukraine. For us, when we are speaking about peace, we believe it must be a just and lasting peace. Speaking about peace means Ukraine must be sure that the end of the fighting does not mean another round of preparations in Russia, neither another round in Ukraine, nor in Moldova, nor in Poland, like we've heard again from our colleague here at the table. Speaking about peace, just and lasting peace, means that Ukraine's existence as a free and independent country is guaranteed. It means security guarantees. This is hard, and every day people are dying. But Excellencies, on Sunday, we have showed what we can achieve if we join forces. We showed that those who want to destroy our charter will not succeed if we stand together and rally around the charter. Let's rally around the charter also for Ukraine in the same spirit, for just and lasting peace for Ukraine, for Europe and the whole world. Thank you.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Baerbock for her statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Lars Løkke Rasmussen, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Denmark.
Thank you, Madam President, distinguished members of the Security Council. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Finland, Iceland, Norway, Sweden, and my own country, Denmark. First of all, I extend A warm thanks to Slovenia for bringing leaders from across the world together. I also want to thank the Secretary General for his insightful briefing, and to President Zelenskyy for outlining the situation in Ukraine and presenting the peace formula. Madam President, today marks 2 years and 7 months since Russia began its full-scale illegal invasion of Ukraine. This marked a major escalation of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, which started back in 2014. And this can, of course, not be tolerated. It must be condemned, and Russia and its representatives must be held accountable. Today, the Nordic countries would like to share 3 messages. Firstly, with its war of aggression, Russia is violating the most basic rules and principles of international law. It is deeply appalling that Russia, a permanent member of the Council, continues to disregard the UN Charter, which is the cornerstone of this institution. The vast destruction and the suffering of the Ukrainian people all stem from Russia's choice to continue its brutal aggression. The Nordic countries will continue to seek full accountability for the crimes committed, ensuring that Russia and its representatives are held to account in a shared responsibility of us all. Secondly, we repeat that Russia's war has grave consequences beyond the European continent. Earlier this month, a ship carrying grain was attacked in the Black Sea. We strongly condemn such attacks, which jeopardize global food supplies. Madam President, it is deeply concerning that Russia's systematic and damaging attacks against Ukraine's critical infrastructure continue. Civilians face immense hardship in Ukraine. Nearly 15 million people are already in need of humanitarian assistance. Russia's intensified attacks affect the lives of millions of people in Ukraine. Across all sectors of life, people lack access to water, electricity, and heating, and the winter is fast approaching. Ending this will require strong cross-regional support, and therefore we urge members to support Ukraine in defending its people and rebuilding its infrastructure, to uphold the UN Charter by holding Russia accountable, and to call for a fair and lasting peace. And this brings me to my third and last point. We need a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace based on international law, including the UN Charter. The Nordics firmly support President Zelenskyy's peace formula, and we encourage all member states to do the same. The Summit on Peace in June reconfirmed the strong support for the UN Charter and laid the foundation for the way forward. Any pathway to peace in Ukraine must be grounded in the UN Charter and its key principles, including Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. Our commitment to the UN Charter and support for Ukraine remains resolute. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Rasmussen for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. At the beginning, I would like to thank also Secretary General for the comprehensive briefing. As we gather today in the Council, we confront the grim reality of the ongoing war, heading towards its 4th year. This conflict inflicted profound suffering on millions in Ukraine and beyond. Unfortunately, since the beginning of the war, each day has taken us further from the peace. After almost 3 years of hostilities, hopes for an end to the conflict is low. Besides, risk of an uncontrolled escalation is still a fact. Escalation poses a threat not only to Europe, but to global stability. International community has so far tried to end the war primarily through coercive measures, but unfortunately these methods have yet to deliver. Whereas the UN Charter mandates peaceful resolutions to disputes, thus we must advocate for a just peace rooted in international law. We must reaffirm again and again our commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. Security Council can bring its influence to bear to encourage the two sides back to the negotiating table. Ultimately, a just peace can only be achieved through direct dialogue and mutual understanding. This basic principle has shaped our approach to the conflict since the beginning. We maintain our position that diplomatic efforts and dialogue should constitute the focus of our endeavors. We continue to stand in full solidarity with the Crimean Tatar Turks in supporting their efforts to claim their rights. Madam President, above all, we must prevent at all costs the emergence of a new geopolitical fault line that will run through Ukraine and trigger a long-term global confrontation. It remains important to encourage the two sides to consider revitalizing the diplomatic track despite the current circumstances. Madam President, as all know, some Turkish initiatives in coordination with the UN yielded some important results, such as Black Sea Grain Initiative, exchange of prisoners of war, capturing sea mines, and some other initiatives are still pending, but we never give up trying. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Turkey. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Antonio Tajani, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Italy.
Thank you very much, Mrs. President. The Italian government, led by Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, has on many occasions, also in this room, started our clear position on the Russian aggression on Ukraine. Italy stands with Ukraine with the goal of a just peace. We stand with an invaded people fighting to defend their freedom and sovereignty. This is a key priority. At the United Nations, in the European Union, and as President of the G7 this year. Just in the last few days, here in New York, I chaired 2 G7 meetings on Ukraine. Supporting the defense of Kiev is crucial, but also is crucial to protect its infrastructures. Our support is focusing on the defense of Ukrainian territories. We are not at war with Russia. Our goal is to achieve peace. We are in favor of a conference of peace also with Russia, also with China, for achieving a good agreement, but peace is not a defeat of Ukraine. Peace is the freedom and integrity of Ukraine. I wish to express our full solidarity with the Ukrainian government and people for the current intense Russian attacks to the energy infrastructures. Winter is imminent. We are very concerned by the situation and we reaffirm our support to Ukraine and its energy sector. International humanitarian law calls for the respect of the energy infrastructures. As I started in our G7 Plus meeting on energy just yesterday, since the start of the war, Italy provided several hundred tons of materials, including generators. Italian government, together with our companies, contributed with important donations. In February, we signed an agreement with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development on €200 million project to restore the capacity of the main hydropower generating Ukrainian companies. We want to do more. President, Italy will host in 2025 the next Ukrainian Recovery Conference. Our focus is on peace. We want to avoid escalatory spirals. In our view, the solution involves starting a political and diplomatic process. Je souhaite maintenant m'adresser directement à mes collègues des pays partenaires.
I would now like to address our partners. We need to work in favor of a just peace and work in this direction. Rome will always be paying heed to such efforts, and we hope to see you all at the June summit, building on what was discussed in Switzerland. This includes food security and the humanitarian response. We are very concerned about the situation in Zaporizhia, and we will continue to support Mr. Grossi. We need to make sure that the Ukrainian agricultural sector is also protected, as this is critical for global food supply, particularly for the most vulnerable. It was also asked that exports of food supplies from Ukraine must continue uninterrupted. We will continue to work on these points.
Commitment to peace needs continuous engagement. Italy wants to do all it can, starting with the upcoming G7 ministerial meeting I will host in Fuji, close to Rome, in November, and the Mediterranean dialogue scheduled in Rome again in November. Every opportunity is important to work for a just peace. Count on the Italian government. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Tajani for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.